بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Today's khatira was a question that was presented to me on why does al-Bukhari repeat the ahadith or some of his ahadith in his Ṣaḥīḥ so many times. First of all, it's important to note that al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala rarely repeats the same identical hadith in two different places with the exact same chain of narration and with the exact identical metin, meaning the same wording. That's extremely rare. Some ulama estimated that to be around 20 or so times throughout the entire collection of Sahih al-Bukhari. The second point is that al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala is known to repeat many ahadith throughout his Sahih. But it's his habit to do so with different variations of the hadith. The variations are either in the metin, which means the text of the hadith, or the variations will be in the isnad, the chain of narrators. There's plenty of repetition of this kind in his Ṣaḥīḥ. There's a hadith that he repeated 16 times. There's another one that he repeated 24 times. In another one he repeated 19 times. In another one that he repeated 26 times. And there's one he repeated 35 times. Take, for example, the famous hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. He repeated that hadith throughout his Ṣaḥīḥ 7 times. Yet not once with the exact same chain of narration. A layman will look at it and say, look, al-Bukhari repeated the hadith 7 times. But a talib ilm, especially one who knows about hadith, will examine the isnad closely and he'll recognize that each of those 7 instances has a distinct chain of transmission. The most repeated hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari was a hadith that was repeated 37 times with different variations. Hadith Anas radiallahu an. أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم غزا خيبر فصلينا عندها صلاة الغداة بغلس فركب نبي الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وركب أبو طلحة وأنا رديف أبي طلحة فأجرى نبي الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في زقاق خيبر وإن ركبتي لتمس فخذ نبي الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ثم حسر الإزار عن فخذه حتى إني أنظر إلى بياض فخذ نبي الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فلما دخل القرية قال الله أكبر خربت خيبر إنا إذا نزلنا بساحة قوم فساء صباح المنذرين قالها 3. That's one of the times that he mentioned this hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. The hadith is about the conquest of Khaybar and the story of Safiya radiallahu anha, her marriage to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, her mahar and the walima and other details. This is the most repeated hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. And it appears in various forms 37 times throughout the collection. Why does al-Bukhari do that? I'll mention and summarize the reasons in 10 wisdoms, inshallah. The first one is that al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala places the same or similar hadith in different chapters to highlight distinct lessons that are relevant for each topic. He needs to use the same hadith to back up what he wants to convey in various chapters. We mentioned in our class in Kitab al-Tawheed of Sahih al-Bukhari, we mentioned that it's not only a book of hadith. It's not just a compilation of a hadith. Sahih al-Bukhari is also a book of fiqh. And we also mentioned that al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, is a unique university in the way that he titles his chapters. Al-Bukhari organizes his work by mentioning a chapter and then a subchapter And then he supports those chapters and subchapters with a hadith or ahadith that provide evidence for the point or ruling implied by that title. For example, the hadith that I mentioned a moment ago, the one that's mentioned 37 times in Sahih al-Bukhārī. There's plenty of details in that hadith. One of the 37 times that al-Bukhārī mentions it in his Ṣaḥīḥ, he mentions it under the chapter about the thigh and whether it's awra or not. Why? Because the hadith contains a small secondary detail that he used as evidence pertaining to the awra, even though it's not central to the main meaning of the hadith. He mentioned it under bab ma yudhkaru fil fakhidhi, the chapter on what's said or what's mentioned about the thigh. The reason he mentions it is that Anas radiallahu an, the narrator of the hadith, was describing how they rode during the expedition of Khaybar, and he said that the Prophet ﷺ was riding and Abu Talha was also riding, and that he was riding behind Abu Talha. He said, my knee, Anas said, my knee was touching the thigh of the Messenger ﷺ. He said, I saw the whiteness of the thigh of the Messenger ﷺ. So it's under a chapter about the thigh being awra. It's also, of course, mentioned under Kitab al-Maghazi, the military expedition, because it has lessons directly pertaining to that. It's also mentioned under Salatul Khawf, the fear prayer. It's also mentioned under Kitab al-Adhan, the book on the call to prayer. Why would it be under that chapter, for example? Because in one of the narrations, there's an addition that the Messenger ﷺ would wait to see if he heard the adhan before initiating an attack on the enemy. Another close example for us would be Hadith Mu'adh radiallahu anh, when the Messenger ﷺ sent him to Yemen, the one we're studying in Kitab al-Tawheed. It's mentioned under the section on Tawheed because when the Messenger ﷺ sent him to Yemen, he ordered him to start with Tawheed. But it's also mentioned under the chapter on Zakah. It's mentioned under Zakah because there's a statement in there that's used as evidence that the Zakah should be given to the poor of the town that you're in. And we mentioned the details on that fiqh matter in the class, Sahih al-Bukhārī class. The point is that he mentioned it under Kitab al-Tawheed, and then he mentioned it again under Kitab al-Zakah because he needed the hadith as proof for each chapter. So the first reason, the first wisdom, is that al-Bukhārī repeats the hadith in various chapters to highlight distinct lessons relevant to each chapter. This is the first and most commonly mentioned explanation for why al-Bukhārī repeats certain ahadith. But the wisdom behind that is much deeper than that. A second wisdom is that sometimes narrators transmit the hadith in full, while other narrators summarize the hadith. They shorten the hadith or summarize it. Al-Bukhārī includes both versions as they were reported to demonstrate this variation. And when he repeats these ahadith, he doesn't place them one after the other under the same chapter. His method is usually to distribute them across different chapters. He uses the full hadith in one chapter when he needs it as proof, then the short summarized version in another chapter when he needs it as proof. Again, this way he mentions both versions. You got the benefit of him mentioning both versions in his Ṣaḥīḥ, but at the same time he uses each one in a different chapter. A third wisdom is that al-Bukhārī rahimahullah ta'ala sometimes wants to provide additional confirmation of a hadith's authenticity. It's already authentic, but he wants to provide additional confirmation. Sometimes he does this by mentioning different chains of transmission for the same hadith. He'll mention multiple chains for the same hadith. And as we said in the previous wisdom, he doesn't usually list all the narrations under the same chapter. He distributes the various different narrations across various chapters. He presents each narration under a different chapter in a different context, rather than gathering them all in one place to increase the benefit. A fourth wisdom is that sometimes he narrates a hadith that's transmitted by more than one Sahabi. Many times there's more than one Sahabi who narrated the same hadith. So he'll mention the hadith in different chapters with a different Sahabi. He narrates the hadith as transmitted by one Sahabi, then he repeats it as transmitted by another Sahabi. He usually places them under different chapters, as we mentioned about the previous wisdoms. This highlights the lesson relevant to the particular chapter, and it also goes to show that the hadith is reported through multiple companions. What benefit do we gain from this? When he repeats a hadith that's narrated, for example, by Ibn Umar, then he mentions it again as it's narrated by Abu Hurairah. One of the main benefits is to show that the hadith is not a hadith that's gharib. Gharib translates as being strange or rare. And the definition of a hadith that's a gharib is that when it's reported by only one narrator at any point or any level in the chain of transmission, whether it's in the beginning or middle or end. If the hadith is only reported by Abu Hurairah, no other Sahabi, it falls under this category. To remove a hadith from being considered gharib, al-Bukhārī narrates it from one Sahabi, then again from another Sahabi, if there's an additional narration, and he does the same thing at different levels of narrators throughout the hadith. What I mean by that is, we understand that if a Sahabi narrated it, he'll mention it. Then if he knows that another Sahabi mentioned it and he needs it for another chapter, he'll mention it with a different Sahabi. But he does this at the level of the tabi'in as well, the second level of the men in the chain. If there are multiple narrators after the Sahabi, he may narrate it once with one tabi'i, and then again in another chapter with another tabi'i. And he may do this for the narrators in the next generation as well, the third level of narrators. He does this at the level of his teachers, his shuyukh. Sometimes he mentions a hadith under one chapter that he received through one of his shuyukh. Then he may repeat it again in another chapter through another sheikh, because he had multiple shuyukh. Sometimes he heard the same hadith from various shuyukh. So one chapter he may mention it from one sheikh that he received it from. Then in another chapter he'll mention it from another sheikh. This repetition has multiple purposes. First of all, what I mentioned a second ago, that it removes the hadith from being a hadith that's gharib. Even though, keep this in mind, even though a hadith that's classified as being gharib does not by itself, in of itself, make it weak. It just adds additional confirmation to show that there's additional narrations to this hadith. That's one benefit. It also demonstrates that the hadith has multiple chains of transmission. It also supports different rulings or different lessons from the same hadith. When he mentions it by one tabi'i in one chapter, and then another tabi'i in another chapter, he supports different rulings with various narrations. So when al-Bukhārī mentions a hadith with a different sahabi or a different tabi'i or a different sheikh of his, it may seem like it's repetition, but it actually adds confirmation and multiple layers of benefit as well. That's 4 benefits. A 5th benefit, or a 5th wisdom, pertains to the presence of different wordings or details in the narrations. Sometimes the narrations vary slightly, and al-Bukhārī may include both versions separately. He places each one under a different chapter. These small differences in wording can highlight additional meanings or clarify certain aspects. A 6th wisdom. This wisdom pertains to the ahadith that are classified as mawsul and mursal. We know that someone who's referred to as a tabi'i didn't meet the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They didn't see the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If they saw the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they wouldn't be classified as tabi'in. They would be sahaba. So a hadith, in order for you to understand this wisdom, you have to understand what's a mawsul and what's a mursal. So you know what a tabi'i is. A tabi'i didn't meet the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A hadith is referred to as mursal when a tabi'i attributes the hadith directly to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam without mentioning the sahabi from whom he heard it. That's hadith that's mursal. A hadith that's mawsul, which translates to connected, That's when the chain of transmission reaches the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam directly without any interruption. Each narrator in the chain heard the hadith directly from the person above him all the way to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some hadith exist in both forms, mawsul and mursal. Mawsul, connected, and mursal, disconnected. Mursal, when the tabi'i attributes it to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam with a man missing in the middle. That man is going to be a sahabi. He doesn't mention the sahabi. Some ahadith exist in both forms, the mawsul and mursal. When the mawsul is authentic according to al-Bukhāri's criteria, al-Bukhārī will narrate it in its connected form. However, he may cite the mursal version in another chapter to alert the reader that a mursal narration exists. Sounds complicated, but it's very easy. Another wisdom is similar to what I mentioned about the mursal and mawsul. Al-Bukhārī sometimes does the same with the marfu' and mawquf. I think this is number 7. He does the same with the marfu' and mawquf like he does with the mursal and mawsul. Again, in order for you to understand this wisdom, you have to know what a marfu' and mawquf are. A hadith that's marfu' is attributed directly to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it. A hadith that's mawquf is attributed to the sahabi without being attributed to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Mawquf on a sahabi, meaning the sahabi said it. Marfu' means the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it. Some ahadith exist in both forms, marfu' and mawquf. Al-Bukhārī rahimahullah ta'ala will mention the narration in which the chain attributes it to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam because that aligns with his rules. But then he may also mention the chain where the narrators attribute it to the sahabi to show that there's an alternative chain of transmission. And again, to add more benefits, he may mention it under different chapters. Another wisdom is that there's a hadith that are narrated with an extra man in the chain. And there's narrations without that extra man in the chain, without an extra narrator. Al-Bukhārī may include both versions in His Ṣaḥīḥ under different chapters to show the validity of each transmission. And like we said, he may distribute them under different chapters. Another wisdom. Al-Bukhārī rahimahullah ta'ala has a rule among his many rules that if a narrator reports a hadith using an'ana, an fulan, from so and so, from so and so. If it's an, from so and so, and that narrator's hearing from his sheikh has not been established, al-Bukhārī does not include that in his Ṣaḥīḥ. It doesn't fall under his criteria unless it's been confirmed elsewhere that that narrator who said an actually heard it from his sheikh. Therefore, everyone whom al-Bukhārī includes in his Ṣaḥīḥ using an'ana has been verified by him to have actually heard from his teacher that he narrated from. Sometimes he narrates a hadith through a route containing a narrator who uses an. An does not establish that he heard from his sheikh. That's not under his criteria. Sometimes he narrates a hadith through a route that contains a narrator who uses an in that chain. But then, because that goes against his rules, he finds an explicit statement or hearing, like the narrator saying, I heard, that supports the previous chain that has an. So he may have an in his Ṣaḥīḥ. An doesn't establish that someone heard from his sheikh. That doesn't fall under the criteria of al-Bukhārī. So he'll go and find another route where he finds an explicit statement that that narrator said, I heard, which supports the narration with an. Al-Bukhārī includes the second route elsewhere in the Ṣaḥīḥ to remove any suspicion of tadlis in the first narration. The final wisdom behind al-Bukhārī repeating ahadith is that sometimes al-Bukhārī rahimahullah ta'ala has one chain and one matan for a hadith, but he needs to use it multiple times. He doesn't want to repeat it without an additional benefit. So one time he may mention it mawsul and in its connected form, and then in another time he may mention it mu'allaq, and sometimes he may mention the matan complete, while other times he'll just select the portion of the hadith that coincides with the context of the chapter that requires it. These are the wisdoms, the main wisdoms as to why al-Bukhārī rahimahullah ta'ala repeats a hadith so frequently. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.